All right, so we're diving into NVDY today.
Yeah.
And, I think your listeners are pretty savvy. They probably already know this isn't like your typical dividend ETF.
Definitely not.
This one's built around, well, NVIDIA.
Yeah, NVIDIA, the AI darling, as everyone's calling it.
Exactly. But it's not about, like, directly owning the stock, right?
It's all about income, generating income.
Yeah.
And they're doing it through options.
Which is where those yields that everyone's talking about come in.
Exactly. Eye-catching, to say the least.
To say the least. And that's why we're here, right? We got to figure out what's really going on. Are those yields too good to be true?
What's really interesting about NVDY is that, it's not actually holding NVIDIA stock directly.
Oh, interesting. So how's it?
It's like they're creating this synthetic version through options.
So it's like simulating owning it, but
Exactly. And that comes with its own, its own set of pluses and minuses.
risks, yeah. And I think we've got some good stuff to dig into today. Articles that go way beyond just the surface level.
Yeah, we're going deep.
So let's start with the basics. Maybe even for our experts in the audience, how does this synthetic ownership actually work?
Okay, so imagine, instead of holding the stock, they're using this strategy, a synthetic call spread. Basically, they're simulating that ownership. So they buy the stock, right? But then for protection, they also buy a put option.
Okay, so it's like they're hedging their bets a little bit.
Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. At the same time, they're selling covered call options on that position.
Wait, so they're selling something?
You're selling insurance, essentially.
Okay.
And the premiums from those sales, that's where a big chunk of that big yield comes from.
Interesting. So it's not as passive as just holding the stock. They're constantly...
They're actively managing it, every single month, actually. Selling those calls, collecting premiums, and then they reinvest those premiums. Okay, which explains why those distribution payouts are all over the place.
Exactly. It's variable. Less risk, lower premiums, less income for the ETF.
It's like they're trying to, I don't know, time the market, but not with the actual stock price, with the what did you call it?
Implied volatility.
Right, right. So it's like they're making a bet on how much the stock price might move, not necessarily which direction it'll go.
It's all about uncertainty and how much people are willing to pay for that, the insurance against it. Like, think about, it's like insurance premiums during hurricane season. The riskier it seems.
The more expensive the insurance.
Exactly. Except here, NVDY is the one selling that insurance.
Yeah.
What goes up?
Can come down.
Especially
Especially with these tech darlings, right?
For sure. And that's where the risk really comes in, because at the end of the day, NVDY's success is completely tied to how NVIDIA performs. So all that to say, even though NVIDIA's been on fire lately, fueling those amazing NVDY returns, there's always a chance things could shift.
Right. And we've seen some of that recently, even with the AI boom.
And that's before we even get into whether or not NVIDIA deserves this valuation or if it's all hype. But we'll get to that.
Yeah. And, it's not just about, like, a dip in the stock price either.
Right.
This is a company, I mean, they're on the cutting edge, right?
Right.
So much is riding on their decisions, whether they can stay ahead of the curve.
Yeah. Their whole strategy, their technology, it all factors in.
And any of that could affect NVDY.
Exactly. And then there's the question of downside protection.
Right. And that's where this whole synthetic thing, it gets really important.
Yeah, because it's not like they're, truly owning the shares.
Exactly. They've got those put options as insurance.
Yeah.
But that insurance only goes so far, right?
Right. So if NVIDIA tanks, like really crashes,
those put options, they might not be enough.
So there are limits, and investors need to, be aware of those limits.
Absolutely. Because we could see some, significant losses.
Yeah, it's not foolproof, that's for sure.
Not at all.
Okay, so it's a gamble. I guess the size of that gamble depends on your, risk tolerance, your strategy.
Exactly. And speaking of which, how would someone even, practically speaking, put NVDY into a portfolio?
Yeah, good question.
Because it's not as easy as, here's your blue chip stocks and here's NVDY.
Right.
You got to think of it almost like a tactical element.
So not a core holding, more of
a satellite, maybe?
Something to capitalize on certain moves.
Which takes a lot more active management, I'd imagine.
100%. You got to be on top of it.
And you really need to know what you're doing.
Yeah, you got to understand your risk, what you're aiming for.
The goals, yeah.
And NVDY even makes sense for that.
Because for some folks, maybe something like, what was it, JEPI?
The JP Morgan Equity Premium ETF, yeah.
Right, and they're both doing this covered call thing, but JPI is way more diversified.
Oh, I see.
It's not all in one company, so less volatile.
Makes sense.
It's like, I don't know, betting on one horse race versus owning a bunch of horses, different races.
Okay, yeah.
You're spreading the risk out.
You might not win as big, but...
Exactly, but you're probably not losing everything either.
And that brings us back to NVDY and this whole, not passive thing.
Right. This is hands-on
I'm
investing.
going to be paying attention.
You got to understand how options work. Really understand it.
And let's not forget about taxes, which, people don't always think about.
Right, because those NVDY distributions,
Yeah.
they're mostly from those options premiums.
Oh.
They might get taxed as ordinary income.
Which could be a bigger chunk than, qualified dividends, right?
Potentially.
Another thing to consider.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The mechanics, the risks, the rewards, even some alternatives.
Yeah, we're getting there.
But before we wrap things up, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about, really understanding how options work.
Sure.
What are, the must-know concepts here for our listeners who might be new to options?
Well, you don't need to be like a Wall Street wizard or anything. There are a few key things, yeah.
Yeah, let's go over them. I mean, implied volatility, we've mentioned it, but it's such a core concept here.
It really is. It's basically, okay, so implied volatility, it's what the market thinks an asset's price is going to do, how much it's going to move.
So it's not about what the price is, it's about what it might do.
Exactly. It's that expectation of movement and a high implied volatility. That means the market's expecting some big swings.
Up or down.
Exactly. And remember, NVDY makes money selling those options and those premiums tied directly to volatility.
So they're not just betting on NVIDIA. They're betting on how people feel about NVIDIA.
Yeah, kind of. It's like they're leveraging that uncertainty,
Again, cuts both ways, right? High volatility means higher potential premiums, but also...
Higher risk, exactly.
Okay, so volatility, check. What about downside protection? We touched on that earlier.
Right, and that's where those put options, they act as a kind of insurance.
Right.
But like any insurance, there are limits.
So investors need to be, really clear on what those limits are.
Absolutely, because, things happen, companies crash, and those put options...
They might not save you.
It's not a free pass, that's for sure.
Okay, so volatility, downside protection. What was the last one?
Time decay.
Right, time decay. That's a big one.
It's the idea that basically options lose value as they get closer to expiring.
Like a melting ice cube.
Perfect analogy. And because NVDY is selling those monthly options...
They're racing the clock.
Yeah, they got to squeeze out as much value as possible before that option, poof, disappeared.
Interesting. So they're actually taking advantage of that melting ice cube.
In a way, yeah, because those premiums, they factor in the time left until expiry the closer it gets.
The less it's worth.
So it works for them, but it also makes things more hectic.
Higher stakes.
Exactly. They got to be on top of those expirations, manage everything, make sure those premiums keep flowing.
Now it's like a full-time job.
It is, which is why, we can't stress this enough, NVDY is not like set it and forget it.
Definitely not.
You got to be engaged, you got to understand options, you got to be ready to, adjust your strategy as you go.
So to sum it all up, I guess NVDY, it's a powerful tool. Potentially, but
it's specialized, right? It's not your typical ETF. You got to know what you're doing.
It's not for the faint of heart.
Or for the passive investor.
Exactly. It's about aligning your goals with the right tools. And sometimes that means taking a step back from a shiny new thing and really understanding what you're getting into.
100%. Knowledge is power, especially in investing.
Couldn't agree more. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Big thanks to, you for, breaking all this down for us.
Happy to be here.
And to everyone listening, keep learning, keep asking questions, and we'll see you in the next deep dive.